All right, Tim, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the Warriors Raised podcast. It's totally an honor to have you here with me today.
Yeah, I really appreciate you inviting me. As I was just thinking, we don't know much about each other. We know of each other, so this will be really an organic way to get to know one another.
Yes, for anybody listening in, this is our first in person conversation, which is, I kind of love doing this. I don't know, it's like a weird part of my personality, but it's one of my favorite ways to record a podcast. It's just like, here we are. So,
I feel you. Yeah, I appreciate it.
so I wanted to start with well, first of all, I'd love to hear what's been the highlight for you of the last few days. Anything that you want to share that's been a highlight?
The last few days highlight. Well, yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is just a lesson in having patience for certain relationships to really take form. I received a call from someone I've known for years that is quite an influence in the health and safety community in the province of Alberta. And we've been talking on and off now about kind of co-releasing a program that I've put together, an e-learning program. And it's just been a very busy year, and they've been very behind on a lot of the things that they've been working on. So it was kind of crickets for a while. And then as soon as I got the call, it was just like, oh, yeah, everything's good. Like, no need to assume, no need to worry. It's just like things take time sometimes. And yeah. So that was good for me.
Awesome. I love that. I would love to hear more about, if you want to share a little bit more about that program before we dive into the Warriors Race aspect of today.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I'm happy to share about it, and by no means do I mean to be, pitching anything here. Really, it
No.
really is. It's my passion work, though, and so
Mhm.
um, basically, the program I put together is it's open to the public to take, and it's like $100 per person, and I call it Workovery Foundations. And so I created this method called the Recovery Method, and the whole idea is to help overworked professionals who really struggle to fit in the time for the things that light them up, their health and well-being goals, and the like, to be able to learn a skill set that infuses rejuvenation and revitalization into their working hours. And we just educate people on how to do that within a few minutes at a time that they already have. So yeah, it's a very easy to go through bite-sized type of program. There's a bunch of videos that are like 1 to 5 minutes long, and so it makes it easy to consume and then get right to implementing what you learn. So
Sounds amazing. I have been really noticing like loving these programs, similar to what you're describing, at least, where yeah, you're really like making something very accessible to somebody to like immediately shift something in their
yeah.
lives. And often when I get really deep into these, I'm like, my grandmother was like telling me these things. Might not be the case with yours, but you know, like there's so many things right now that I'm observing where it's like people are coming back to um, like a more holistic or wholesome approach to also realizing that, especially for entrepreneurs, people who are working towards really big goals, there's often this like, um, well, there's often a hustle that's happening and coming back to like, wait, if you can even take 5 minutes or 10 minutes in a really busy day and optimize your own well-being, it's also going to show up in the work that you're creating and putting out into the world or showing up with your team. And I love to
Hmm.
hear that. Well,
Hmm.
keep me posted on how that develops.
Yeah.
So to dive into Warriors Raised, why we are really here today, I
Yeah.
would love to hear from you what got you into training martial arts. What was
Uh,
the initial thing that brought you into the world of martial arts?
So rewind way back to when I was 6 years old, and as I was born in Alberta, and when I was 6 years old, we moved to Newfoundland so my dad could work on an offshore oil platform. And so we moved there. We're now on an island, not kind of in a landlocked province. And my parents were like, you know, hockey was a big thing for us growing up. My brother's older than me. He played a fair bit more than I did at that age. And they were like, but we want you guys to be able to choose what you want to do. We're in a new place. It's different here. It means a whole lot more to actually travel, to have to go off island to compete across to different provinces and stuff like that. And they were fully supportive of it, and they just gave us this choice. And it's such a cliche thing, but my memory serves that it was inspired by the Karate Kid. Hey, it would be kind of cool to learn how to kick some ass, if at the very least put up with some bullies being the new kid on the block. So, yeah, we joined a karate club, and it was through a traditional Japanese senpai in a Tsuroka karate style. And I loved it. And we did that for 4 years until we moved across the country again, but into northern British Columbia. Um, and I stayed with it as much as I could. I got into Taekwondo, and things, a lot of stuff has happened in my martial arts journey. But yeah, I trained a lot of different styles until my mid 20s, and life and injuries and careers, all that kind of took center stage. And it's only been recently that this year I got back on the mat in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So
Nice. Amazing.
yeah.
And so what brought you like this year, this recent time, what brought you back in to training?
Mhm. Well, I could say I was definitely feeling ready during the pandemic, and it was also a big question mark and a risk in that it's like, one, I wasn't too sure when I'd be ready to go get all sweaty and intimate with strangers coming out of the pandemic. And two, like it had been years of not training, on and off low back injuries, different stuff that I had accrued from different sports and accidents, things like that. And just like an overall sense of, well, like I'm not sure where I'm going to be because my wife and I are in a nomadic phase in our life, and m- because I grew up moving around a fair bit, I felt like I was hesitant to go join a club because I didn't feel like I could commit long term. I
Mhm.
bounced around a lot growing up, and then I'm pretty nomadic now. So I'm like, well, if I go and commit to a gym and then leave, it just feels like a lot of stop and go.
Mhm.
But I just said screw it, and so I'm training wherever I can drop in at this point. So
That's awesome. And are you predominantly training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or yeah?
yeah, 100%.
What was your, I'd love to hear, like, it sounds like you've trained many different forms. Can you give us an overview of like what led you from one to the next? So starting with the Karate Kid, which I love, and
Yeah,
I train with people who I'm sure, I'm thinking of one young man I train with in particular, who I'm pretty sure that was a big part of his.
yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that was a big inspiration, just and even finding a traditional Japanese, just like very polite, very strict. We would recite kind of like this whole thing about being respectful, endeavor, be faithful, respect others, and refrain from violent behavior. And that was kind of like the mantra I was raised on. And then we moved to northern BC, like I said, joined a Taekwondo club. And about a year and a half into that, one of the instructors was killed in a volunteer firefighting accident. And I wouldn't say that's the reason I quit, but I just like felt like it wasn't right for me, and I had a good connection with that person. I didn't feel connected with the other instructors at that time, and it was a really small town of like 5,000 people up in Fort Nelson, BC. So there wasn't really a lot of other options, and I was starting to get into basketball and track and field, and I was really avid in band. I still play in a band, just not in concert band, and like in school. Um, and then after about a year and a half, I got the itch. I was watching a lot of UFC, and MMA was really becoming a big thing, and George St. Pierre was just like, oh, like I want to be like him. And I went to one of the Taekwondo instructors that I knew, who was also a school teacher, and he knew I played guitar. And we were talking one day, and he talked about wanting to learn. Say, hey, like I want to get back into martial arts. I could teach you guitar if you want to teach me Taekwondo again. And so we did that. And then he introduced me to some guys that were training out of an old machine shop garage, and they used like the pulley system that you would lift and hoist engines out of vehicles. But it was perfect for hanging bags and being able to divide the room. And at that time I was like 16 and training with these adults that were training for cage fights, and it was just like this cool thing for me to do because it was detached from school. It was detached from cliques or who's the cool kid, who's the tough kid, who gives a shit. Just get in there and train. And you know, because you train, like, talk is talk, but the truth is told on the mat, you know. And so it's just that was really good for me, and it helped bolster this like sense of my own autonomy, my own independence, my own path. And it came to a point that I really wanted. I knew I needed to decide what I was going to do. I was nearing my graduation from high school. I loved the martial arts. I loved the idea of being a business owner. And so I was like, I had been put actually on a bracket to go and compete in my first amateur cage fight, and two opponents pulled out in a row. And so I had to make this choice twice. And then by the time there was a third name, I was like, maybe it's just not for me. Like, do I
Mhm.
accept another fight? And I went back, I was really struggling with this decision. I went back to my original karate instructor who I hadn't talked to in years, sent in me an email and said, "Hey, I'm having this dilemma. If I know if I choose this path, I should go down it because it's a big risk, right? Like getting punched in the head, whether you're getting paid or for free, is still getting punched in the head, putting your health on the line, all that kind of stuff." So I knew I wanted to commit to whatever I chose, and he said, "Hey, like, if you're choosing between going to school or getting into cage fighting, I'm not going to tell you what I think, but I'll tell you, you know, think about the amount of energy you're putting into the decision versus how much energy you'll have for a decision that you've made." And so it was just kind of like, okay, like that was really good. I should just make a decision and go. And so I decided to go to school, and I'm really thankful I did. But I
Yeah.
didn't stop training. I was moved to Calgary. I got in touch with kind of, they were training a couple of UFC fighters, but they're on the other side of the city from where I was. So it was like hour and a half on public transit during rush hour to get there. So I tried that for a few weeks, and it was just too much of a time commitment. And then I started to notice that there was opportunities to train martial arts kind of like alongside the running track at the recreation center. And that's when we started to get kicked out of the gym because it wasn't covered under liability to even hold pads for each other or to just practice some wrestling drills or do jujitsu on some mats. But I saw a lot of people training on the bags and getting kicked out for the same reasons. And I was in like this business and sports degree, so I took the opportunity to get help from my professors to create proposals and programs and to go through risk management and liability exercises and proposed to the school to start a student club. And so we started like the first collegiate MMA club that I ever have heard of, and that ran by the students for the students for I think like 7 or 8 years. So
Wow, that's so cool. When was that? What year was that?
we started in '09, yeah. And then I stepped away 3 years after, but like there, I had someone who started it with me, a good friend, business partner, and he continued to help just like bring in the students and help them become managers of the club, and then continue to bring in personal trainers to do the fitness, and then find other instructors in Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu or Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, and just see what kind of, masters we could attract to come teach. So
That's amazing. And what was the club like? Like, how many people did you have
it's
coming
a
in?
overall in my time, our average roster was 20 to 30 regulars, 2 times a week, 2 hours a piece. So yeah, it was a good crew, and all kids, all ages. A lot of students, but a lot of adults, and I made a lot of good friends from that community. Other friends today. So
Really neat. I love to hear that. Like, especially when there's that need to train. And
yes.
so it doesn't exist yet where you are. So you find a way to make it happen.
Yeah, I was
And
pretty hard-headed, and I really pissed off a lot of the administrators at the time because MMA had such a bad rap. But they had a karate club, they had a wrestling club, they had a Muay Thai club, a kickboxing club, and they had a stunt cheerleading club. And so we did a deep dive and gave them a whole essay on all of the risk, all the injuries, and all of the stuff that goes into every one of those, and said, hey, like MMA is still not, at that time, nobody really had ever died. in an MMA match, but now that a lot of time has passed, that has happened, but still, like, catastrophic injury is really common in a lot of sports, and it's pretty safe, as you know, to be in the right environment and to train against each other.
Yeah, for sure. And if you've never done it and you're on the outside looking in, it
Yeah.
can look very chaotic and
Can't,
dangerous.
can't promote cage fighting. We're a post-secondary institution. It's like, yeah, I
Yeah.
get it.
So I'm really curious, going back to when you were 16 and training in this like shop where
Mm,
you were the only teenager training, is that right?
yeah.
Yeah.
I was a teenager training mostly with other adults that were like, working in the trades, but wanting to fight at the same time. So.
I'm curious how that was for you in terms of like being such a formative time as a young man. Like, did you have a relationship with these guys beyond the club, like conversations afterwards, or how did that impact you?
A little bit here and there. So the one guy who was teaching primarily, who kind of rented the space, he had a lot of experience in Hapkido and taught all over the world. So a lot of like self-defense, a lot of standing self-defense, small joint wrist lock manipulation, standing chokes, takedowns, how to swim behind people, get behind people. And then the other guy he brought in was his friend, used to compete as an Olympian in judo way back in his heyday. So that was a tough guy to deal with. Those guys were awesome. They didn't have the best reputation in the community, and that was weird for me because I never got to see the like douchey asshole side of them. I just really got to see the passionate martial arts instructor side of them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then a couple of the other guys I got to know a little bit. One in particular, we were coworkers for a while as well because I was working at a tire shop, and so we got to cross paths. I would say none of them they were never my friend material.
Mm-hmm.
But being in a place with those folks kind of showed me that like I don't need to be a tough kind of meathead getting in fights at bars to earn the respect of other people and other men in the community, and because that stuff never mattered to me, honestly. Um, I think it's part and parcel from moving around a lot growing up. I cared less about faking it and just cared more about being me because who cares? Like I can always just move on to the next person if it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
work, you know. So that's kind of how I think it really helped me in a social aspect. And yeah, I don't know. There's many other things there, but I guess as well, like it it really focused me. Like during that time, I was also, as teenagers do, getting in kind of like head over heels in love and dealing with all sorts of drama and gossip and weird dynamics with friends and whatnot. And that drove me insane, quite literally, it felt like at times. And I didn't know how to find myself in those years. But what was grounding for me was hitting the gym, training martial arts, playing basketball, showing up early to school so I could practice guitar on my own in the band room. And like by the time I was 17, I was doing all these things athletically and also through like dedication and focus. There was this other element of like watching how my grandparents were aging and passing, and then watching how my dad was aging and struggling with his own like alcoholism. Nothing too serious, but something that he just really couldn't seem to put down. And I never understood, from watching my dad and also watching other community members that were in their middle age, I never at that time understood like how like being healthy seems so easy to me. It's like, well, if you want to lose weight, exercise, eat well, right? Like, how can that be so hard? And I never understood. I could see these people causing themselves all this pain and grief, but I never understood the pain that was behind them
Mm-hmm.
doing these things. And so I was really vehemently kind of like, I don't want to fall into this path of alcoholism. And at that time, I had been drinking a fair bit on and off with friends and going out, sneaking out on weekends, stuff like that, hiring bootlegs, all that shit. And at the same time, I just saw a lot of kids going down that path. A year didn't go by that a teenager didn't die from alcohol or drug related something.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going through a big breakup and I was struggling to just like stay motivated. And I thought, I want to do big things in my life. I knew that. I didn't know what, but I knew then I wanted to do big things. I didn't want to stay in that small town. I wanted to explore. I wanted to, create. And so I said to myself, like, if I can't commit to being healthy now as a 16 or 17-year-old going through these hardships, I can only imagine how hard life is going to be and that there's going to be way bigger commitments that I'm going to be faced with. So I'm like, well, I'm just going to not drink for a year. And I just said it's bad for my training, it's bad for my performance. I had goals that I wanted, I had like records I wanted to beat in track and field, and I just decided not to. But I still went partying. I still went out. I ended up being a designated driver, and like I made a lot of friends with people who I would never hang out with in school just because like I was the one they could talk to when they were drunk needing a ride home.
Mm-hmm.
You know. And so to wrap it all up, like the dedication to martial arts and being true to my craft and not wavering was really kind of like the centerpiece for me then.
I love that. So you took a year away from drinking when you were 16 or 17.
17, yeah, my whole grad year.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I love that you were still able to go out and
Yeah.
party. I mean, that's been basically my whole life, but but it's not something that everybody can navigate, where you're able to go to a party and feel comfortable in that environment, still have a good time. Sounds like you're having fun, dance, whatever, and not actually be drinking. It's a skill.
Yeah. Some people couldn't figure it out, so I found out a few months in that there was all these rumors that I was just doing like ecstasy instead. I'm like, what? But to their testament, there was times that my pupils would get so dilated because I don't know what, like maybe I don't contact high. I don't know if that's a real thing, but I credit it to just like actually I was able to get into altered states just because I was committed to showing up and having fun and staying up late and letting loose. I would just kind of match the energy of the room, and then next thing I know, my pupils were like there was times I'd get home at night and be like, "Holy shit!" Like I feel totally sober and fine, but I'm so wired.
Yeah, I've had that experience a lot. And it's 5 o'clock in the morning and people are like, how are you just drinking water? Like, what's
Hey,
going on? But I do think you access an altered state that feels very much like being high or contact high or whatever you call it. But yeah, apparently there's some science behind that to do with sleep deprivation, but we won't go
oh
into it.
yeah, yeah, and I could imagine you've had your own experience with that being a busy mom, and I'm not a father yet, but I have worked shift work as well, and yeah, sleep deprivation is no joke. Like you
Yeah,
can get in some pretty loopy states, I find. Yeah.
yeah. Well, and I tend to find like a euphoric state, not if I'm doing it too frequently, but
Hmm.
the right amount. I find like a euphoric state or a deeper connection to God or whatever. Often when I'm like driving home after driving everyone home, like that
Uh-huh.
peaceful moment of, or even the next day, just kind
I
of
would
interesting.
I would credit that to that the fact that we really do, like regardless of if we're are awake or asleep, our nervous system and our brain function is always trying to oscillate between different states, right? And this is happening on like a 90 to 120-minute cycle all the time, whether we're awake or we're asleep. And if we're going through periods of sleep deprivation, I think we would still go from like a beta to an alpha to even borderline theta, where it's
Mm-hmm.
almost dreamlike.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's like a real lack of filter behind what you're thinking, feeling, or sensing even.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's interesting. My wife, when I met her 12 years ago now, she was just coming out of a bad year of insomnia, and she talked about similar things where yeah, she'd have waking dreams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, insomnia, that's a whole other bag of worms right there. So you guys have been together 12 years, and you said you're not a dad yet. Are you guys, are is children part of the vision for you guys?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it hasn't been the easiest vision though. I mean, there's miscarriages that have happened before me
Sorry.
and me. And yeah, thank you. It's one of those things that I think is very common and not often talked about. And I think in our society, talking about death, accepting death, embracing death is a hard pill for a lot of folks. So that's been something that has been important for us to just really be okay with being open about. And yeah, like my wife's older than me as well, so there's a kind of like the people always say, oh, the time's ticking. It's like, yeah, but at the same time, there's lots of moments where 40-year-old women are in the right place, the right mindset, have the right level of certainty and safety, and then they get pregnant, and it's like the best ever. So
Mm-hmm.
I haven't lost faith, but we definitely are keen on doing it in a safe way because we know now what's going on there for her from like a genetic standpoint. And then, I mean, I worked in youth services for a period of time as well, and we know that there's a lot of really amazing kids out there that we would love to bring into our households. So adoption is definitely on the menu.
Wow, what an incredible journey. When you said that, I was thinking about I was 19 when my first son was born, and one of my closest friends at the time was in her early 40s. I believe she had her first at 42 and her second at 44. And I just remember like we'd hang out and help each other with our toddlers. Like she'd look after my son while I went to yoga, and I'd look after her sons. And sometimes she'd want to run track and field. Like she had so much energy and vitality, and easily would have continued to have more kids, except her husband didn't want that. But yeah, there's a lot of stigma and fear around um, pregnancy past a certain age, and also to backtrack to what you said about it just being something that's not talked about. Like I don't know if you know from reading what I've written, but like we had a fourth son who died when he was a newborn.
Oh, wind
And
of that, some of your posts, yeah.
yeah, and what was remarkable about that, I mean, like I could write two books about that experience, but coming home to our small town, like we live on an island with 10,000 people. And my ex-husband, when he would like go to the grocery store, people would come up, like women would come up to him in the grocery store and be like, I lost a baby at 6 months, or he was just like, he'd come home from the grocery store every time and be like, wow, I had no idea women were experiencing this so frequently and just not telling anyone about it. And I wasn't surprised because I know how these things are. Often it's just like you sweep it under the rug, and like it's yeah, I don't know, it's phenomenal what goes into, like I look at my three sons and I'm just like they're all like healthy and strong, and like they don't really have any problems like with that. And I'm like, we're miracles. Like I'm always amazed that people don't believe in magic. Like I'm like, do you garden? Have you like seen what happens with like
Yeah,
how babies grow? Like
here's
tiny little seed. That's like,
yeah,
like all these things. Like it really
yeah.
is um, a miraculous thing, and beautiful to hear your awareness around your wife's process and yours and the journey of. But
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes it does require that like feeling of deep safety, and like there's been some really interesting dialogue in the world of polarity and relationships around that, around like conception, and that is a rabbit hole I won't go down right now, but it's really really neat. And yeah, um
Well, I'll just say one thing more on that. Is that I think, hmm, there's a lot that I think has been ignored and, like you said, swept under the rug about particularly women's health and fertility. Um, and it has kind of, in some respects, been really bastardized. Where on one sense, like femininity, and it's different nowadays. Like I'm glad that femininity and masculinity are really under a spotlight. Maybe not in the best way, but
Mhm.
there's a lot more conversation now about these things. And I think the more that we can understand how not just women's fertility works, but how the state of our nervous system plays into our bodily functions, like the better it is for all of us. Um, all of us are carrying, if it isn't just a genetic thing, it's like we're carrying a lot of what our society and our parents and our grandparents and their parents and their parents and their parents have all kind of normalized and and had to suffer through. um, and in many ways I believe in all of us that we are carrying the burdens but also the blessings of our forefathers and foremothers, and in some ways it's kind of up to us how we carry that torch, you know. And so just like little things around the friends that have kids in our lives, and in my own family, my niece and nephews, being able to like offer kids like a deeper insight into really what the power of their body is, and to normalize what it means for a woman to have a menstrual cycle, to normalize what it might mean to have fertility problems, and to help women navigate these things, I think is just like such an important aspect, because it's like the lifeblood of our society is the womb, right? And so it's amazing how little is actually known in common knowledge around the womb compared to, you know, space, which is something none of us will really ever reach.
That's the perfect analogy. I always think of the womb as being like space anyway. So like anything is possible here.
Yeah, if anything, it's like more amazing because it is like kind of like you said, we are magic in that sense. We are these electrochemical, bioelectrochemical light beings, you know, that I don't even understand. I don't think most people understand even how the body actually stays alive, for example, right? Yeah, that's a rabbit hole for sure. But
Yeah. Well, and it's fascinating too, like in our in our culture right now, just how little awareness there is, like you say, around like um I remember going to see an acupuncturist about 6 weeks after our son had died because my system was like did not know what to do. It was so familiar to me to give birth and then breastfeed. And I was like waking up multiple times in the night in a total state of panic and alarm. Like my body was looking for
yeah,
that. It was very, and my system was like not resetting. And I went to see an acupuncturist. And of course, Chinese medicine is actually like 5,000 years of optimizing women's health because they wanted to have like 20 kids per family at one point in their
yeah, at one point.
history, right? Yeah, not so much anymore. But, you know, so just this awareness of like how to optimize fertility. And it was phenomenal. Like I left her office and my whole system was like I remember just feeling like, okay, this is going to be intense, but it was like you know, the beginning of multiple resets that my system needed to be like yeah, to find its way home, because it's also such a symbiotic relationship between like it's this whole immaculately designed process of conception, pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, that your body, the wisdom of your body is phenomenal. You know, that's and but I just love even the, I don't know, I guess it is the circles that I move in, but the awareness of this. Like I went through a grading recently when I got back from Austin, and I was, at the end of the grading, I was destroyed. Like I was so
In jiu-jitsu.
tired. Jiu-jitsu, yeah. And my coach came up to me. I've also like had concussion for a year and a half, and my symptoms with that are like really minimal right now. But that day at the end of this intense grading, like he came up and he was like, was that too much? Like, are you okay? How's your head? Because I was definitely feeling it. I was like, yeah, and I'm also 2 days away from my period. And just being able to say that, like when I was a teenager, I didn't want anybody to know at all. And I love like the teens in my community like you'll go into the bathroom and they'll be like, hey, can you ask me a pad? Like they're just like super open. And my friend's son, who's like 19 or 20, carries like pads and tampons in his backpack for his girlfriends. Like, wow, we are getting somewhere, definitely, just that awareness. But
Yeah, I believe so. And I think it goes to say that it's important that women really get what they need during those few days, especially, I think it doesn't have to happen all the time. Like, of course, from a survival perspective, if you got to get up and go, you got to get up and go. But, the more that I've witnessed women kind of ignore their needs during that time, the potentially worse and worse their symptoms can get. But that's just anecdotal, right? Not to mansplain here.
that was the perfect mansplaining. That was great. We'll take it. Check. So I really want to ask you this one question. And that is, in your experiences in martial arts, what is the hardest thing you experienced? Like, have you ever been in a fight or a competition, or even just like a moment where you're like, well, this is going to take everything? Curious.
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing is I've been able to avoid virtually every street fight potential that I've been in.
Mm-hmm.
Credit my original karate instructor for that. Like, if you can avoid starting violence, that's the first step, and then stopping the violence as soon as possible is the second step.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even though I trained a lot, I think, I don't know, and you hear this from even like the elite of the elite, that coming into a fight, like, there's a lot of fear involved. Um, so yeah, I've been pretty scared to like get into altercations, mostly because I just don't want anyone to get seriously hurt on either end. And so there are times that I've literally like let a guy smack me and then been like, "You good now? Like, do you want to have a good night or bad night? Because this could keep going one way or the other." Or, "Hey man, like, do you just want a drink?" Or, "Hey man, sorry, I didn't mean to piss you off. Like, I take responsibility here. Here's $20. Just have a few drinks on me. I'm out of here." Like, I don't need to prove myself to a lot of people. On the other hand, if I see someone that is getting hurt or being like totally taken advantage of physically, it's like I have to get in there and I won't stop until it stops. So there's one time in particular that I can remember, and it was actually, I was still sober when I was 17, and it was supposed to be kind of like our grad skip day. And it got late into the evening. Oh, this could be a story, but
Take your time. There's no rush. Yeah.
this is where I ran into like, I didn't understand, like, similar to how people were spreading rumors when I said like that I may have been doing drugs instead of alcohol. There was like this going narrative that I was like this UFC fighter. And granted, like, I was buzzing my head and all that stuff, but I was never really like a bully or an asshole, in my opinion. I mean, I'd like to crack jokes about people from time to time, but yeah, anyways, I'm driving people to and from this campground for the grad skip day because I was like one of the only designated drivers. And it was supposed to be just for grad. And then like some of these older guys started showing up who we knew kind of were friends with some of us, but really we kind of knew they were there to maybe deal drugs. And so a lot of people didn't like that. But this was happening when I was out on the road. And so when I got back to the campsite, there were these older guys who I knew about them, bigger than me, stronger than me, all that, who had been told like, yeah, like, wait till Tim comes back because you're not supposed to be here and you're gonna have to answer to him. So I like get out of the truck and then I'm getting confronted by these guys. Now I had no idea what was going on. And I was able to talk my way out of having to like enforce anything, but I just said, hey, like, out of respect, really, like, if you want everyone to have a good time, I need you to get the approval of everybody around here and promise that you're not going to start any shit and yada, yada, yada. And if there is, then you're going to have to deal with me because, yes, I train like 5 days a week and I train with XYZ person and you know who they are, right? You don't want like So it's kind of like, I don't want to have to show you, man, but it'll go bad if it has to. And that was good. Bunch of hours go by, and then I had gone to sleep for a while in my truck and got up to use the washroom, and which was like way down by the lake. And then I come back up to the campsite and I see someone just getting just like on the ground, right?
Mhm.
Recognize it's one of my best buds, and I like go and split it all up, pull one guy off. There's some older guys there that I didn't know who they were, didn't even know that they had even shown up. And then one guy tries to smack me. I like get out of the way, and my hands are up, but I'm ready to grab and do whatever I need to. But one of the guys was like, "Hey man, that's Tim Kessler. Like, you may want to think twice." And the guys left. I'm like, oh, well, that's weird because like at one point I was resenting this reputation I had no control over, and then it just like helped me get out of that situation. But it just turned out that one of the kids that showed up late in the evening, I think, had been bullied at a young age and dropped out of school. And then that was kind of his chance, his redemption to get back at some guys that had really been mean to him in like grade 9 or grade 10. And yeah, thankfully it diffused, but it was strange because two of the guys took off in their vehicle and left one guy there stranded. And he was kind of like the kingpin of the whole drug thing going on there. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, why are you here? Because now you need a ride from me to get anywhere. So,
That's wild. Did you drive him home?
yeah, yeah. He was pretty convincing. He's like, man, like we literally, yeah, we were here to deal drugs, but I don't know what got into that kid's head. He just pulled your buddy down from behind and didn't stop. So,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Interesting. That is cool. I often wonder, like, what it would be like in a high school where, or even from an elementary school age, where people were routinely training martial arts, because there's something that happens there. Like I watch there's like a small group of boys who wrestle before we train jujitsu, and some of them are friends, some of them are not super close, but it's just like very hard to like ongoingly hold a grudge with anyone in that kind of environment, right? Where
Yeah,
you're,
yeah,
and I don't know if part of it is because you're just like happy to have people to train with, and but there's also just something that really diffuses that. Like there's something really interesting that happens on the mats. I mean, I know I've like slap bumped with people where I'm like a little bit scared, or maybe they're chaotic or new to fighting, or just whatever they have going on. That is, usually it's like an energy thing where I'm like, feeling a little fear here. But then
yeah,
as you start moving, it's amazing how that can be like transcended into something else. And
yeah,
you're like breathing, and you're just like stay in your own, play your own game, and at the end of 5 minutes or 6 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, you're like slap bump again, and you're like, oh, I actually like feel this person in my heart now, and we're good. That has been one of my favorite aspects of training jiu-jitsu, is like having the opportunity to work through those instinctual fears, and then be like, wow, I actually just like see your humanness
Mhm.
mirrored back to me.
I definitely see that similar to kind of, you always hear the stories that, guys can fight and have a beer together after,
Mm.
you know. Um, and I think that I've experienced that in a lot of ways also, where even after a good verbal sparring, there's respect earned. But I
Mm.
think as well, like you touched on, when you're that intimate physically with someone, there's a lot going on, not just increased muscle activity and reaction timing and your core temperature changes, your adrenaline pumps, your breath's high, your breath rate's higher. Oftentimes you're like trying to focus on just controlling your breath. And every moment matters. Like you can't be thinking about anything else in that moment, even your anger, even your frustration, Um, and so I think that when we do that together, there's instant camaraderie, and you almost can't get you can't detach from it. Um, Thinking from even from like an early childhood development, stage of life, babies start to learn how to regulate their nervous system from what they're seeing on the face and in the body language of their mothers and in their caregivers.
Mhm.
And when you think about like going into a concert, for example, you could hear a song that maybe you like, maybe it's just okay. But if
Mhm.
everyone else starts singing and stomping their feet and clapping their hands, it's pretty contagious, right?
Mhm.
Even if you don't like the band. But I'm just trying to draw from different parallels here that, yeah, there is something special going on from a co-regulating type of aspect for our nervous system when we're really engaging with people. And I really
Mhm.
appreciate your post around like men maybe don't need therapy, they need Fight Club. And
Mhm.
that is a really powerful proposition.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it helps in a lot of ways with emotional regulation because if we imagine a society that doesn't do any sort of training in martial arts, there's a really detached sense of what actually is possible and not possible in this in the face of violence or conflict. And we see this in the police force where they really only get like 16 hours worth of hand-to-hand combat is what I've heard. I don't know where that's true or not true in the world, but it's very little.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of those police officers will get into situations where they know that their life could be under threat any minute. So they'll avoid getting physical before using lethal force. But if cops were to be trained up to like a blue belt or even higher as part of a requirement, then I think that they would be way more discerning and way more comfortable in getting their hands on people to subdue them uh, before having to rely on lethal force, for example. And same goes for just, I think, men's ability to, if they struggle with violence and anger, if they had more experience being very physical, especially in a combative way, they may actually realize that violence is not the answer and that they're, because of training on the mat, the ego, like you said, kind of gets dissolved. I think it can open a pathway to help men realize that all this pent up anger and energy and frustration doesn't have to result in like violence, but it can result in something else. It can result in an outburst, but in a different way.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And even just that, well, you really touched on it of in your own experiences where you've been in fights and you even just like let somebody hit you because you know you're going to be fine. Your aim is to diffuse because you don't have anything to prove. You know exactly how much damage is going to happen if it comes to that. And that, across the board, that's what I've seen. I went to 10th Planet Jiu Jitsu recently in Austin. And like I was
Bucket list, I want to go there for sure.
definitely go and like make sure you can go at least 2 or 3 times. But walking in there and then maybe about 20 minutes into the class, I just had this moment where I was like, wow, I'm here. Like, I don't think 3, 4 years ago I would have had the
Mm,
confidence or comfort or even just like kind of like stepping into an alternate universe in a way. And yet what as soon as I walked through the door, what was really evident was such like calm, welcoming, deep confidence that's not like this like facade, or there's absolutely no faking it till you make it in martial arts. And this was just like a room full of people. The first class I went to was all men. The second class were like 5 or 6 women, but just who were all just like laid back, nothing to prove, like so much love in the room. And also, that if shit hit the fan, they're like, they've got this. And there's that luxury afforded to those who know that they can diffuse something really fast, right? And it's an interesting, I know for me, like I grew up with a whole like narrative around like fighting being bad and all of that, right? Like there's a lot of that
yeah.
that's present in our culture, like a misunderstanding of aggression and aggressive energy, especially for men. Like if men are suppressing that or not connected to it, it can show up in very shadowy ways in their lives, even in intimacy, like in just like not actually owning and honing that part. And then also, of course, that aggressive energy is also part of what helps men like be focused and purpose driven and happy and fulfilled and like have their testosterone levels where they need to be. Like it's actually a very natural part of being human, you know?
Yeah. And you'll find I like to go into like what's going on in the nervous system through this is kind of a theme that I hold with these types of things. And what I could imagine is that, you know, if we're not comfortable with conflict or with physical combat, whether it's in a training situation or a real life situation, we'll go to one of the two kind of like spectrums of either fight or flight, where we think we can take on the world because we've never been beaten before. But if we haven't been tested, how do we actually know? And or we end up on the very fearful side where lack of confidence, scared to engage, scared of the root of conflict overall, scared of the consequences of it. And that can be very self-degrading as well, right? But if we're very comfortable with that, like, as you know, you go to a training session, especially with people that are all better than you, it's like, you can't even count how many times you're getting tapped that night, you know?
Yep. How did you know?
Yeah, it's just like, that's just the path. And learning to detach your self-image from failure, I think, can be very healthy. And to be safe in the face of someone being better than you, or not being as good as you thought you were. Or for me, like getting back into the martial arts, I was scared of not having the cardio, of being weak, of not having the reaction time, of getting hurt. And all those things came true when I got back on the mat, and I still was able to get through it with a smile. And that just proved to me like, yeah, like it's okay to be scared of these things, but like I'm durable, I'm strong, the body will heal, you know? But yeah, the more that I'm involved with it again nowadays, it's just like it's spanning to other parts of my life where I'm okay to be vulnerable in different ways with things that I've been scared about, and I'm happy to take ownership of it and move forward. And even if it only means I'm moving an inch forward, it's just like great. Now it's out on the table. Now I know where to improve. Now I have clarity, rather than hiding behind the fear of what it might lead to, or you know, holding grudges or resentment about people in my life because of something. And it's like, that's an old story, man. It's like, until you've actually tested that theory and had a real encounter, that old theory might be totally wrong, you know. Same with your image of what you may or may not be capable of in a fight. So
I love that. I often wish that I could take the wisdom or even just the, like, I don't want to say rules, but like the natural consequences that you experience somewhere like jujitsu. And I'm sure it is infiltrating, I know it is infiltrating into the rest of my life, but that, even what you're describing, for me right now, a lot of my game is still defending, and I will measure my own how well I'm doing by how calm I'm staying, how well I remember the defense. Like I take actually a lot of pride and pleasure in making it really hard for somebody who's a higher belt to submit me. Like I'm like, I just frustrated that person. Like, like, and maybe I tapped 4 times in 5 minutes, but I still am like, it wasn't 10 times, you know, like they look a little annoyed, like, yes, like a lot of that inner journey of like, well, yeah, that you're getting destroyed physically, but emotionally you're just like zen, smile on your face, breathing through your nose, like cardio's there, whatever, like the things that, and then like you say, training the knowing where your weaknesses are, training those, right? Like it's I mean, I find, to like totally spill this over to entrepreneurship, I find it's so easy to just keep doing the things I'm good at rather than being like, hey, your back keeps getting taken in this or whatever, the
Yes.
analogy is, because it's fun to train things we're already good at rather than being like, I can never escape side control or whatever, like.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with you, man. And man as a colloquialism. I think like I think in entrepreneurship, there's so much about that where for me, like I trained a lot of individual sports, martial arts, track field, yeah, golf. That's a whole other story, but yeah, I worked and lived. I lived next to a golf course and worked on a golf course for years. But anyways, there's this essence of being an entrepreneur that comes with a similar humbling journey of like I can do it on my own until all of your weaknesses get exposed and they keep smacking you in the face, or and I think for a lot of folks, like every time it's tax season, it's just like, oh, well, now I know whether I've got my shit together or not, based on how much work I have to do to get my stuff submitted every year. So
Yeah.
there's there's adaptability, there's learning how to pivot when the market changes. Like the pandemic shifted practically every business, you know,
Hmm.
and it did for me. And in some ways it was a blessing, and in some ways it was a burden. Yeah. And to be here now, like there's still things that I'm like, why have I not figured this out? It's been like
Hmm.
my whole career as an entrepreneur, but hey, I'm still here, I'm still in business. And the cool thing is, like, most of my good friends, I'd say like 90% of my good friends, they're all in a similar path. They're business people, they're entrepreneurs, they're passionate, they're renegades. They've had to learn things the hard way and, lean on others a lot of the time and be humble that there's still time to figure things out, and the things you leave behind and don't work on will fester and they'll come back and get you at some point and you'll have to deal with them.
Yeah, that's wonderful that you have that in your friend group, because I often think of, trying to improve in your skills as an entrepreneur. Without that, it would be like trying to train martial art without somebody else to train.
Yeah.
It's like you actually need to be in an environment, or like you said, when you're, for me right now, jujitsu is great because I am like, I just got my blue belt. I'm like still often, everybody, not always, but often I'm in a room and like a lot of people are further along in their journey than me, so I'm learning a lot, right? But in entrepreneurship, I think that is so valuable. And I'm curious for you, if you notice in your journey, are you still training? Is it like the same weaknesses that you're training weak spots? Or have they evolved? Like sometimes I measure my own progress as like, wait, this is a problem you haven't had yet. This is a good sign. You know what I mean? Where
Yeah.
like, this is a new weakness for training rather than always the same ones.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question because it's sometimes easy just to focus on like there's different approaches, right? And as a white belt, as a blue belt, there's such a long journey ahead. You've got lots of time to put in the reps and figure things out. And so I find myself struggling between being like, am I just going to be reactive to whatever comes at me and try and survive and not get tapped and be defensive, like you said, and not really have a game plan? Or should I really, yeah, put defense up front, but then also be very dedicated to one type of system, like one
Mm-hmm.
type of setup for one type of move, right? And I've seen both be very successful, where like you see folks go into competition and they're doing the same things that they were doing on the mats to people as good or better than them. And that can expose weaknesses as well. But I guess, yeah, to answer your question, I feel similar to what you said. It's like I sometimes I think that I'm not going to get stuck inside control, and then I get stuck inside control.
Yeah.
Or I'll be like, oh, like I think I've really figured out a few ways to get out, and then it works, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think it's important to as I'm learning anyways, to first focus on protecting yourself. Second, focus on getting really good at a few sequences and not trying to pull off every opportunity, every choke, every grip that you can get, because you're going to do them all sloppily, or you can do a few of them really well if you train that
Mhm.
way.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. That's always the interesting thing I notice in my if I start to get into my head, I'll start to think about like, well, what moves can I pull off with this opponent rather than just going with my like bread and butter, or when I'm in a zone of wanting to expand what I'm doing and not just go for my bread and butter, but actually learn new things. And so then there's like, I'm going to be more creative and there's going to be more mistakes. And yeah,
And
it's
I think I think both are important, right? And I love at least the few instructors I've had this year. I value some of that traditional sense where it's like there's kind of like a curriculum for drilling before you do kind of open mat rolling. And that kind of like tempers the like, here's the strategy, now just go for it. Um, and to tie that to life, to tie that to business, like I find a lot of entrepreneurs tend to be really creative. And so it can be easy, and I've found it to be to my own detriment easy to want to try all the things and to implement all the ideas and not get a lot of progress maybe on any one of them as time goes by. But then but I almost I need that to find the things that I will focus on for the long run and really delve into and get stronger at. Um, I need those quick failures. You hear that in business too, like learn to fail fast so that
Mhm.
you can find the gold. Um, and even in some other, like, I don't know if you've heard of Ido Portal before. He's like a famous movement kind of instructor for his whole methodology around movement.
Yeah, I have heard of him, but I don't remember the like the movement style or what. Yeah.
It's one of those things that's hard to explain, but I think the way he describes it is that he looks at all the realms of movement as this big circular uh, set of opportunities, and we're at the center. And so anytime you're trying to get good at one thing, you're always moving away from something else. And so his approach to movement is to hit all of the different types of skills in more of a like a spiral type of facet. So hitting on many different skills, but they all have their own progressions and their own programming that you can develop. So it's like coordination, it's balance, it's joint dexterity, hand balancing, squats, deadlifts, cleans, jerks, um, play, a little bit of martial arts style stuff. And what I like there as well is that there's this sentiment from him of like fail until you fail to fail. And I think that suits what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Fail until you fail to fail. Yeah. Well, and there's something about well, just overlapping with like entrepreneurship and martial arts. Like there's something um, I know that I wish if I could just like give myself an elixir or my clients who are entrepreneurs an elixir, it would be that. It would be to be like, let's get hungry for making mistakes because let's get hungry for failing because that is how you grow. And yet that's where the fear comes in. It's like, well, what if, it doesn't go well? Or what if we look the fool? Or what if we get tapped out? Or that's such a hindrance, or when you're just in that play of like, I mean, I have training partners in jujitsu where it's so playful, and then suddenly that's where like a new pathway forms, and like, and that's where like the new magic comes, and you're like, whoa, I can't believe we just pulled that off, like what just
Yeah.
happened, but it's in that also very deeply relaxed state of deep presence, right? Of like bringing that into the rest of our lives. I'm
Yeah.
curious for you how you think that. I mean, I kind of have gathered a sense of this already in our conversation today, but how you think that training martial arts has impacted you in your relationships, like in your marriage or other relationships. How do you think it's, I guess, maybe helped you show up in a way that you want
Yeah.
to? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that when we think about this idea of getting comfortable with failure, it's great because it helps me to recognize that um, really that it's okay for me to show up and be wrong. It's okay for me to show up and potentially hurt someone else's feelings, my wife's feelings, and it creates an opportunity to build trust that they can handle it. And you get to find out if they can't handle it. And then you have something new to deal with, something new to work on. And if you don't actually go forward, you can get really stuck in this state of fear, rather than finding safety in the face of fear. Um, and for my wife and I, like, it's 12 years, and I'm sure you feel like, I don't know how long you've been with your current partner, or if
I
your
was
kid.
married for 18 years from
Okay.
like met my ex-husband when I was 18 to 36. And then we've been separated 4 years. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, long-term relationships, life can change. You know that just because you've dedicated yourself to one person doesn't mean that they're going to be that person for you tomorrow. Um, my wife and I have really faced that. We've had a few very tough years, and that was before we got married. Like, we were together 10 years before we decided to get married.
Mhm.
And it was from coming out of a really dark time that we really found each other again, and found each other as individuals, and were able to like tell very hurtful truths just so we could get to clarity about who we really are. Because you hear a lot of things in relationships, it's just like, after 10 years I don't know who you are anymore. It's like, well, maybe I'm hiding behind this image that I think I need to be, and you're seeing this image of me that I used to be, and then we actually don't know each other anymore, and it's not safe to be even seen anymore. And that I see that happen a lot in relationships, not just partnerships, like spouses. Yeah. So, like, I actually was thinking about this before we jumped on, and one thing we had read, we eloped, and that wasn't the most popular decision with the family, but we had this read at our ceremony, and it's by Khalil Gibran, and it's just his thoughts on love and togetherness. And it's about, like, love one another, but make not a bond of love. Let it rather be a moving sea between the shores of your souls. Fill each other's cup, but do not drink from one cup. And it goes on with this sentiment of, like, you are two individuals, and you need to fill your own cups and share from your own cups, and not depend on taking and giving, in either direction. And it hasn't always been that way. Like, I have been a people pleaser a lot in my life, and I have held the women that I've loved on pedestals, and stifled myself down to try and, like, please and, make them right. And a lot of it out of fear of actually facing conflict, and that doesn't really have room in our relationship anymore, you know. And yeah, so I'm really thankful that, one, my wife is kind of like she's a quester for truth. She's she's a somatic experiencing practitioner. She's a certified attachment therapist. Like, she's gone and found a lot of knowledge about the nervous system and about how we relate to each other, just for her own journey. And it has also been this thing that's really helped us to see past these images and these pieces of resentment that we've held about each other, and to really find safety. And I think, to tie that again back to martial arts, you're not going to find the truth unless you really actually go up against each other, but
Mhm.
with love in your heart, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I always say like safety is not found in the absence of threat. And this really applies in relationships too. And like when you're in intimacy with someone, your heart and soul exposed, hopefully. Like it's not about the absence of threat or conflict or disagreement or anything about that. I love is actually very timely, just what you're talking about, just a few people I'm working with right now, even just that awareness of what happens when you both pedestal your girlfriend or wife, and also being in that people pleaser and like afraid of the conflict and not knowing how to deal with it, or um, not wanting to hurt someone's feelings or create more pain, or like how do you where is your responsibility in theirs, where does that end begin, like
Yeah.
it's a dance. Yeah.
And it is, and it's never perfect. Just like jujitsu is like, there's been a lot of times where, my wife discovered early childhood trauma way later in life. She had repressed memories, and then it was confirmed by her family and all these things. So the woman I met didn't think she had any of that. And then years later, she rediscovered it, and her capacity and her tolerance became very limited, which made
Mhm.
me feel like I had to be extra careful and extra protective because she couldn't handle certain things. But
Mhm.
that's useful only to a point. If I continued to try and protect her from me, from other things and people and all these things, it only started to then start to enable that weak, hurt part of herself, you know?
Mhm.
So I've had to really learn like where it's okay for me to push her
Mhm.
and that she'll be okay, or let her do her thing and that I don't have to be the one to jump in and
Mhm.
solve anything. And that helps me stay with my feet on the ground and just be like, okay, I'm here for you, but like, what do we do next?
Mhm.
Take the lead.
Mhm. Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, that's definitely yeah, I love to hear your awareness of that, just of how to be present with that without taking it on, and without um also then creating an identity of, like you were saying a couple minutes back, of you're in relationship together, you're both evolving, but then at a certain point do you still know who the other person is? Because relationships ultimately are containers for evolution and growth and expansion, and if we're not careful they become the opposite of that, of like stagnation or stunting growth, or like, well, here's your wife at this certain point in her life, coming to terms with things that happened that she didn't remember, and that's suddenly really present. And of course it's going to be like if there's like a fire in your house, right? Like it's when that stuff first comes to the surface, it's a very, very intense experience, right? And those around you are like, how do I help? What can I do? And yeah, it's a very, I mean, that's a whole other warrior's journey in and of itself, especially for men, to be able to hold that in relationships. And you're not the first man on the Warriors Race podcast to go into this. Like, just I love hearing from men who are like, okay, I want to be present for this and not lose myself, and be present in a way that is encouraging and allowing growth and healing, and not enabling or whatever the other would be. So it's quite a
Coddling, those kinds of things. And tie this back to martial arts again, I think that when dealing with people that in relationships, where if someone's at a different level with their journey, with their pain, with their level of emotional intelligence than you are, either you can offer them an opportunity to learn, or they're going to offer you an opportunity to learn. And I see that with like going up against people that are higher belts than me, where like they are so happy to train with you, even if they're smashing you, or especially love it when I can tell they're just like giving me openings, letting me get close to sinking something in just so they can practice their escapes. And it's just like, gosh, it's like in some ways I just love that element of relating to people that way. And it's very humble, but it's also a way I think that we can kind of like walk with each other through life, is that you're not going to just like force someone to solve the problem, but you can definitely give them an opportunity to grow.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And
And
also,
that's, I think, where
go ahead.
that's where sometimes in relationships we can get stuck, like thinking like, oh, I just don't understand, why doesn't this person just get it? Will they ever just get it? Or like you hear like in relationships, there's a lot of kind of like finger pointing when there's that kind of frustration going on. And I think that that in some ways is like it's built around just like not understanding, I guess, the other person and their journey and their actual capability. But in some ways, like kind of like going back to when I didn't never understood when I was a teenager why my dad just always needed to have a drink or two at night. It just drove me nuts. And I
Mhm.
thought a lot. And through the years, I fought with him about his health a lot. And now I've learned that I just can't change him, but I
Mhm.
can love him. I can be good to myself. I can make good choices around him for me and for others. And, just like create the space and opportunity so that when and if he's ready, he might take it, make a different choice himself.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a it's a challenging thing to be able to like to hold that, like to hold love for someone, especially like with your parents or somebody really close to you, where you're like, I actually really want to see you thrive and be your most optimal self. And it's I find it can be quite painful until we've made peace with that. That not everybody has that same desire or the same level of desire for happiness and thriving and really, yeah, it's an interesting thing too in terms of um like warrior mindset. Like the warrior expects their body to heal, right? It's not, it's like, oh yeah, they can sustain anything, and the body actually just gets stronger each injury, and the mind just gets stronger each obstacle that we're overcoming, right? And we live in a culture that's like predominantly victim mindset, so it's really interesting navigating that even in close relationships. If you are wanting to be able to still see the warrior in others even if they're denying it, that's for me, that's probably a lifelong thing, like.
With you. Yeah, I've heard that sentiment that that a lot of what our society doesn't have is like rites of passage that maybe have been more formalized and still are formalized in other cultures. Kind of like we said, eventually life will take you through your own rite of passage. Um, but depending on the community and the people around you, that can really dictate whether there's like a lot of good lesson or just more trauma through that
Yes.
scenario, right? And like I had a pretty cozy upbringing. I never really had anything like big T trauma happen to me. But yeah, there's definitely complex shit that's gone on. And I got to my mid 20s, where I was starting my second business. I was coming out of working as a shift worker. Before that, I was a personal trainer, and the reason I got into shift work, I wanted to learn about mental health. So I like jumped into the front lines as a youth worker and all that for like 4 years. But coming out of that, I just like needed to do some soul searching. I wanted to be a father. I was really still wrestling with a lot of like, who am I as a son? Who am I as a brother? Who am I as going to be as a father, a friend, all those things. And it just hit me that I should just like take myself on a vision quest. And this is a story I don't think I've really ever told publicly, but yeah, I was
Well.
like 27 and I had done some fasts before that. So I wasn't too worried about going 4 days without any food. But one thing led to another, and through some community members, I was actually able to get introduced to a whole area in the southwest part of Alberta in the foothills, that where the foothills kind of like border right onto the mountains. So it's kind of you're on the last grassy hill before you see these beautiful mountains pop up. Um, and I just knew I needed to go out there and really face a few things. And so, yeah, I found a tree, a big, beautiful limber pine on a ridge line, and I sat there for 4 days in one place. Well, 2.5 days until a thunderstorm came, and I had a Plan B spot to get off the mountain for safety. But and I'm glad I did. It was a pretty nasty storm that came through. To me, that the reason I kind of bring that up is because I think it's super important that we put ourselves into really hard situations and face some adversity, especially if we're like finding that maybe life's a little too, I don't know, not easy, but if we're like, for me, I was struggling with boredom, and I was
Mhm.
struggling with that, with being like an entrepreneur, but also having ambiguity. Like even right now, I'm sitting in a house that I built and running a business that I built. But there are days where it's like, I don't know what the next step is to do here. And especially with technology, it's really easy these days to get distracted and to have our attention taken and brought into other areas. So I just like didn't want that to be have such a tight grip on me, and that was part of why I went out there. It's like no technology, just me and the birds and the elements. Not even a tent, just like a tarp and a waterproof sleeping bag. And
What did you glean from that experience?
um, in some ways, it's like there's two sides of it. One is like I could look at it as I just went and sat in the woods for 4 days and came back hungry,
Hmm.
be very insignificant. And there are parts of me that kind of actually feels that way. It's just like, oh, so I did all this, but why?
Yeah.
And I had friends and people worried for me, like, why are you doing this? And on the other side, it's like, well, life, anything we do in life can be as meaningful or as meaningless as we really choose it to be.
Mhm.
So that time really helped show me that there's any moment, anything that happens can have a message for you. Just like pulling a tarot card. It's like I'm a logical guy, I'm a spiritual guy at the same time. It's like I kind of know that the tarot deck doesn't have a secret for just you.
Mhm.
Any card you pull can have a meaning for you. It's just the tarot deck I view is like a really interesting look at the human experience.
Mhm.
So, so yeah, like I have literally had moments that were very small in a time scale that were way more significant than 4 days sitting under a tree, for
Mhm.
example. I think that's one thing. And then the other thing really is like I spent a lot of time up there just reflecting on my whole life. I brought a journal with me that I had kept most of my life up until then, and
Mhm.
I just reread it all. And then I wrote reflections on all of it.
Mhm.
So that was really good for me too. It just kind of recentered me on my path and helped me really face down some of the things that I've seen my grandparents struggle with and my parents struggle with, but also the things that I love about them, that I admire
Mhm.
about, I really do look up to and want to be a shining example of. So it was important for me to have that time.
Mhm. Well, and I love what you said about like, actively seeking rites of passage, that it's something that isn't present in our culture. Your self-chosen year of sobriety would be one. Like I mean, I have three sons. Two of them are, I would say, on the other side of that journey, and seeing their own self-chosen rites of passage. Oh man, like they like it's instinctual and that need, but that is why you have these extreme things that teenagers are doing, where you're like, no, you actually need to be taken out by a group of older men to go hunting and to see if you are ready to be part of this journey called manhood, where you're an asset to the tribe on the hunting trip and not a liability. But instead, like, you have men in our culture, like, 15, 16, 14, it's different ages, where they can feel that need and their options are, well, there's sports, that's a pretty good one. If they're
Yep.
fighting, that tends to be one that like keeps them somewhat out of trouble. I mean, like training martial arts. But then there's like drinking, partying, social craziness, all those things. But so yeah, like I agree with you. There's an absence of that, but in terms of rites of passage or initiation, there's something to be said for like, okay, I'm going to choose this time, and yeah, it might not actually seem all that significant, and then there are rites of passage or initiation that happen in life where you're like, wow, like death is a perfect initiation. You have no control over what happens, right? And you're like, you have to face all of that, like the emotion, the lot, like death of your parents, whatever it is, death of a loved one, death of a child. You're like, okay, life is happening. I am not in control of this experience. Childbirth being another one where you're like, okay, there's like this living being inside me that actually needs to come to the other side. And again, like don't have any, I mean, people try to control it. It can be quite controlled, but you know, without medical intervention, it's not something that you're in control of. It's just happening. So I think those experiences are so important. And I notice when, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but what happens when people stop seeking those, you know, like you, where it's like, no, I don't think rites of passage is meant to be like a one-time thing in our lives. I think it's something we're meant to continue to experience to a degree that is valuable for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that when we don't chat, when we aren't putting these challenging situations in a conscious way, we start to lose touch with what we're actually capable of. But we're also maybe we'll lose touch with things that, like we talked about earlier, where we have blind spots about our own weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes we will start to think that, well, this maybe this trait of mine isn't the best trait, but it's just who I am. It's just who I am. So
Mm-hmm.
whatever. It's like I appreciate that attitude to some degree, but I also appreciate when someone's like willing to actively work with it, on it, and to be vulnerable enough to say like, hey, like this is the way I am. I didn't choose it, and I'm willing to grow and learn. Um, and so depending on where we're at, like death will find us, sickness will find us, in a lot of ways, financial hardship will find us. Um, but if we feel like that's just being done to us and that there's nothing we can do about it, it's pretty easy to be the victim
Mm-hmm.
and then to start to demand that everything else changes around us
Mm-hmm.
so that we can be safe, rather than being like, well, everything actually can change around us and I am an active participant in that, and how I respond to these things will also come back to me depending on where my focus is, my mindset is. And I had to be really aware of this right after we lost our baby in 2019, because that was on like April 1st, April Fool's Day. Fuck. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
and then that month, on the 20th, so April 1st and April 20th, my grandpa died. Kind of expected, but he was my last living grandparent. 4 days after that, we discovered my dog had a tumor, so we had to put him down. And that was the first. That was my first experience, like taking the dog out to the back part of the acreage with a gun. You know, kind of rite of passage.
Mm-hmm.
4 weeks later, our resident cat was like taken by a coyote, and I found the evidence of it. So it was just like boom, 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 all in a row, right? And
Mm-hmm.
at that time, my wife and I went through a lot of just like, well, and same with my family, like we were all in it together pretty much. And we are just like, well, we have nowhere to go but to embrace this.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no, like the best thing that I decided to do at that time was just to like really, really, really feel it and really make room for the grief, really make room for the emotions, as a way to get comfortable with them. And the other thing I learned from that time was like when you go through hardship, it really kind of shows you what is important and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
My tolerance for bullshit really went away for that period of time. Just like, is
Mm-hmm.
that serving me or not? And it wasn't personal. It was just like, so it helped me make some pretty big decisions in my business, to be honest, as well. I knew there was things I wanted to change before that time, but then during that time, I'm just like, okay, enough of this. This might be a surprise to you, but you're gone, you're fired. Don't want to do business with you anymore. Like all this clarity,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, when your bandwidth gets smaller, or you're just your energy, your availability for bullshit goes down, it's incredible what happens. And that's like actually often something that I will try to trip start, or whatever the word is,
Mm.
in myself or my clients, of like, without needing the catalyst of like, four people dying, or four
Yeah.
beings dying, you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
yeah, no, and of course that is those, like you said, like grief is like being able, choosing to feel it and be with the emotion is letting like, I believe grief is actually a totally sacred experience that is meant to like run through us and move through us and like purify it, or purify is not the right word, but
Cleanse.
illuminate who we really are, like reveal ourselves. And there's, in those experiences of intense grief, you really discover who you are.
Yes, we do. We definitely
Yeah.
do. And I think the more that we can learn to embrace a lot of that, the more composed we can be. Um, we were camping with a bunch of friends this last weekend, and some of the women took an opportunity to ask a bunch of us guys, like, oh, yeah, so speaking of which, what do you think the sacred masculine's all about? And it was really cool to sit and listen and hear what was being talked about and said. And one thing I will echo there, and I don't even remember who said it, but it was just kind of like this idea. It's like when we think of who can be the leader of the tribe, you can have someone who might seem emotionless and cold, but very like calm, or you could have a leader who has all of their, who could present very similar, who could present very cold and emotionless, but actually they have all their shit together, compared to the other person who's cold and emotionless and just like doesn't have their shit together. And those two archetypes, like one could be making really good decisions for the tribe, and the other could be making decisions out of fear, lack, anger, unwillingness to actually do the work and face the emotions and be responsible, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like they say, you'd rather meet the warrior on the battlefield who's been in 1,000 fights. I completely butchered that, but basically
yeah,
that line, it's
yeah,
the same in life, right? Where you're like, I went through this thing and I didn't actually skip over it, but I milked it for every piece of wisdom. And for sure that's going to show up in masculine leadership, especially also being able to then understand what's going on in those around them, right? And they're in the needs of the group, or I love that that was part of your camping conversation.
yes.
Yeah, awesome. This has been amazing, and I'm actually a little tempted, if you would like to close this out. I'll leave you time to share anything else you want to share before we do that. But to close this out by hearing the rest of that poem that you started to read.
Yeah,
I don't know what you think about that.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'll start with the one line here. So yeah, fill each other's cup, but drink not from one cup. Give one another of your bread, but eat not from the same loaf. Sing and dance together and be joyous, but let one of your each one of you be alone. Even as the strings of the lute are alone, they quiver with the same music. Give your hearts, but not into each other's keeping, for only the hand of life can contain your hearts. And stand together, yet not too near together, for the pillars of the temple stand apart, and the oak tree and the cypress grow not in each other's shadow.
Ah, it's beautiful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, I'm
Uh,
getting all personal and goosebumpy now. That's forever going to be a special one for me.
yeah, that's incredible. Appreciate you for sharing that. Is there anything else you wanted to share today? Anything?
Yeah, I mean, I've stepped into a place this year where I've traveled. I've been on Vancouver Island. I'm back in Alberta, and I've just got this real like community building sense. I want to see people. I want to gather. I want to invite. And so I've got a number of just like no cost opportunities to practice some rejuvenation during people's busy work days coming up, and some other co-hosted webinars in September. So yeah, I'm on Instagram at Coach Tim Kessler. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, and then a good friend of mine he's a kung fu black belt. He's We're going to be co-hosting a men's retreat at the end of October here on this beautiful property. This property is like it's like a living medicine wheel through and through. And my parents have just constructed their dream. They've it's been called the Sacred Dream Lodge. It's this yurt that has beautiful artwork done on the inside that have all sorts of beautiful like archetypes from many different cultures. And so it's a very intentional space. And because it's kind of new, I'm really keen to host something in person, and we just really want to bring together some men that have found success, but are lacking the feeling of significance in their life, and to help respark some of their connection to themselves, their loved ones, their passions, and do it all under the beautiful big sky here in Alberta.
This is amazing. Please send me the details for that so that I can have that in my awareness. And
Yes, for sure.
that sounds phenomenal. And yeah, I would love to talk to you more about that as well. And that answers also my last question is like, what else is next for you? And that sounds like part of it. It's
Yeah,
like,
that's a big one. We're actually going to be selling this tiny house here in the next month or so. So life's changing for us again. We're going to be moving on to like a historical home site for the fall north of Calgary, and that'll be a whole other like I'm sure I'll host events out there too because it's pretty awesome.
beautiful.
Um, yeah, more community, more just like finding the people, places, and things that really are important to us, and continuing to keep those relationships alive. So
Awesome. Well, it's been wonderful to build this relationship and to meet you here today in the space. And super appreciate you joining me on the Warrior Race podcast. I'm going to close the recording and then you and I can say goodbye. How's that?
sounds
Yeah.
good to me.
Okay.